Hi, Clive Stafford-Smith. Welcome back to 10 by 6. You've been on the programme twice before. An amazing.
Tell you, I want to make it a bi-weekly event. It's just part of life now.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be absolutely brilliant. And this particular episode, we're going to focus on your experiences in death row in the southern states, Louisiana, Texas, that sort of area of the US.
We call it the death belt.
The death belt. Yeah. But you were extraordinarily successful, Clive. So you had a sort of 98% success rate, didn't you, in terms of taking ensuring.
Let me just clarify that.
Okay.
When I was young, I read a book called How to Lie with Statistics, and there are 3 types of lies, as the famous American author wrote, and that's lies, damned lies, and statistics. And that statistic is a bit of a lie. I only lost 6 of over 300 cases, so you can call it 98% if you want. But the truth is, a lot of people ended up getting life in prison, and I don't view that as any great success. And indeed, in one trial I did of Brian Kohlberg, he was convicted. He wasn't sentenced to death, thankfully, but he was convicted, and he was patently innocent. It was a shaken baby case, and which is just something that's legal term is total bullshit. And the poor guy was convicted. So, I view any of my clients who ended up with life in prison as a failure rather than a victory.
That is in itself an outstanding virtue for somebody who's dedicated and committed their life to defending people who can't afford to defend themselves, as opposed to many situations, I guess, where they get an inexperienced lawyer who's just finding their way, learning the protocols, etc. But ultimately, it's about their career. Whereas it's never been like that for you. You've been entirely committed to the people you defend.
I mean, the bigger problem actually is not always young people who end up doing capital cases badly, and I did them badly when I was young. It's sad to say that because, when I went to law school, which was Columbia Law School, posh law school in New York, the vast majority of my colleagues took the #1 train down to Wall Street, where they were paid $1,000 an hour. When we were doing capital trials in the Deep South, we were paid $1,000 for the whole case. And so you really get what you pay for. And unfortunately, that means that an awful lot of the lawyers, not necessarily young, they're just hopeless. And they're doing capital cases because they really can't do anything else. And that's extraordinary when you think about it, that we spend so much money and give so much talent to corporations who frankly don't deserve it. And we give so little to people whose life is on the line. It's horrific in my view.
So what was different between you and the guys who trotted on down to Wall Street then at that time? What was it that led to you to move down to the southern states and to
get involved in human rights? No, I came from the southern states because I had originally aspired to be a truly, truly despicable human being. I wanted to be a journalist. I mean, can you think of anything worse? Some media person who was peddling all this sort of rubbish like you.
It could, but it could be John Pilger, couldn't it? I mean, we can't write all journalists off with.
No, I'm only just trying to write you off.
I know.
But I had gone to America planning to write a book about the death penalty because I was very young and very arrogant and very stupid. And I thought I could write the seminal book about how wrong the death penalty was. Suddenly, everyone in America would see the error of their ways and change their mind. And when I was 19, I did go to the Deep South to write this book, which I did write, which fortunately has never been inflicted on the world by a publisher. But I spent all that time, I spent a semester and then a whole summer visiting people on death row. And I discovered that in Georgia, and likewise in all the states that had the death penalty, you had no right to a lawyer if you were poor, no right at all. Once you were on death row, you had a right to a bad lawyer to get on death row. But once you were doing your post-conviction challenges, you were meant to represent yourself, and you were meant to represent yourself even if you were a juvenile, mentally disabled, incapable of reading and writing. You nevertheless had to represent yourself unless some do-gooder came along to volunteer. And so even I, in my immense arrogant naivete, even I could figure out that I could do more good as a lawyer than as a writer of bad books. And so that's why I went to law school, and I only went to law school to do that. Whereas unfortunately, most of the people who went to law school went there to, make money.
So having come then from the southern states with the intention of writing the book, you go to New York, you become a lawyer. So all the way through, it was always your intention to go straight back down again and work in human rights.
Yeah, I had to get a fees at Columbia, so I had to figure out a way not to pay their student loans, which I did, and then figure out a way to fund myself going back to the South. Because the trouble is, when I went back to the South, I was like 24, and I knew nothing, and so no one would hire you, obviously. So I came up with some money to pay for my first year, so I could just go volunteer for the Southern Center for Human Rights, as is in Atlanta.
And then, actually, before we move on to Louisiana, can you remember your very, very first case on death row?
I do. There are two ways of remembering that. There's your first case and your first trial. My first case was an appeal in Mississippi. And actually, what was extraordinary about that was how easy it was to win them. I'd been trained in the sort of academia of the law. And so writing an appeal was actually not that hard. But the real test came in my first trial, where I was a year out of law school, but they let me represent this guy for his life. I shouldn't have been representing people on traffic tickets. I had no idea what I was doing. And I represented John Pope, and dear old John. Anyway, I was doing the closing argument at the penalty phase of a capital trial. And I did what any sort of pompous English public school boy would do, which was to quote Shakespeare. The quality of mercy is not stained, it droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven, and all that good stuff. Anyway, this old lawyer came up from all of my lessons I learned were learned at the cost of the clients. And this old lawyer, Bobby Lee Cook, came up to me and he said, "Clive, that's a mighty fine piece of poetry, but these here jurors don't know who Shakespeare is." And he said, I used that same quote myself last week, and I began by saying, I think it was in the book of Job I read. And of course, because he attributed it to the Bible, he won. And, that was my first lesson, which is that jurors only speak a particular language in the Deep South, and it's the language of Christianity. But, that was my first trial. John got the death penalty, unsurprisingly. And fortunately, we got it reversed on appeal. But, that shouldn't have been allowed. I should not have been allowed to be representing that poor man.
And I mean, thankfully, the appeal meant that he didn't get the death penalty. And as you said earlier, that even though they might not get the death penalty, the fact that they get life imprisonment in many cases is you perceive as just as much as a defeat.
Well, it's a death sentence, isn't it? You've been told you're going to die in prison.
Yes.
Just not immediately.
Yes, no, absolutely. I'm just trying to think, sort of, how many cases did you go through early on, from John Pope onwards, before you felt fairly confident giving an address in court, or were there a few sharp lessons as well as John Pope that got you into that position quite quickly?
the first two cases I did, John's and then Willie Gamble's case, I was manifestly incompetent. Fortunately, after that, I did a lot of trial level cases, but we pled them out. And back in those days, we thought that a life plea was an enormous victory. So, in 1984, 85, I did those two trials. Then from 1985 to about 1990, I never had to try a case, thankfully. But I got lots of courtroom experience, but never had to go to trial. So none of my people got the death penalty. And after that, I was beginning to figure out how to do some of this stuff. And we only ever had one other case where the guy got the death penalty, and that got reversed as well. So fortunately, after that, I sort of knew what I was doing and didn't lose any after that.
Can you then take us into, this is now 1987, with 14 Days in May, how you got involved in that project?
So it was very much divided up between doing trials, doing direct appeals, which was really quite easy and efficient, and then habeas, post-conviction cases. And then the thing that is the most difficult, but is also the most honorable, is to represent someone on what is called a successor habeas, where they've gone through 9 levels of appeal, which sounds a lot, but they're normally 9 useless levels of appeal. And then, you get an execution date and you have to try and stop that. And in America, you can go through 6 of those levels of appeal again. But it's very, very hard, because at this point, they hold against you the fact that you haven't brought up issues that, earlier. And so in 1987, my friend Ken Rose had been representing Edward Johnson, and unfortunately had lost in the Federal Court of Appeals. A decision that later the US Supreme Court said was wrong, but Edward was dead by then. And so Ken asked me if I would do a successor for him, which, I was glad to do. And, this was another example of the extraordinary arrogance of youth. I was only 3 years out of law school, but I hadn't lost someone to the chamber at that point. And, we'd managed to stop quite a lot. And I thought, this is a mug's game, it's pretty easy. But again, I was doing things back then that when I look back today, I look back in total horror that I didn't know what I was doing. And if I knew then what I know now, Edward Johnson would be alive. His birthday's coming up and he would be 61 years old next week. And he's not 61 years old, because when I did his successor, we just had 3 weeks. But I didn't investigate his innocence, because back in the day, we thought that the thing you do is raise all these technical legal issues. And so it was a total nightmare. And the only saving grace of the whole thing was that Paul Heyman with the BBC was out there with cameras and was filming the whole thing in what became 14 Days in May. And actually that was really great for Edward, because he thought that because Paul was there right up till the moment I had to walk into the gas chamber with Edward, Edward really thought someone was going to call cut. When you're an innocent person, like I'm convinced he was, it's very hard to believe that society is actually going to ultimately kill you. And you always think something's going to happen. And he did. And actually, his very last words, I gave him a hug in the gas chamber. The warden was a very decent guy and let me go into the chamber with him. And when Edward hugged me, he said, "Is there something you know that I don't know?" And I didn't really know what he meant at the time, but of course I figured it out later, that he really thought that we were still going to get it stopped. And we didn't. And the poor guy died a horrible death, suffocating to death with Zyklon B is what they use, the same stuff as the Auschwitz chambers. And, he was killed. Dreadful, dreadful thing.
And there's 2 things that come to my mind, Clive, and obviously you're feeling back this experience that you had. So just forgive me if it's the first two things that come into my head aren't appropriate. But
God knows what's coming into your head.
no, it's not like that at all. No. Firstly, do you think Edward Johnson partially believed that he would get off because the BBC were there? Because
yeah,
it was big.
I think he thought that this was just a movie and that it was being prolonged for movie's sake, and that someone would call cut and that would be that. I really think he felt that. But that was good for him, because the worst thing you can do, and I've sometimes asked in the cases where my clients have been killed, I've asked the governor not to tell us that he's denying clemency until the last minute, because I know if he delays that clemency is going to be denied, but the client doesn't. And the very worst situation you can ever have for someone in that is for them to be denied all possibility of relief ages before, because then they just have to sit there waiting to be killed, and that's just horrendous.
So hope becomes yes, yeah. And the other thing that came to my mind,
hope sort of rhymes with opiate, and it is an opiate, and it's an important one really to give people hope, because it does help them get through.
Yes. And of course the situation that you describe in relation to Edward Johnson, also in that you didn't investigate his innocence, but the lesson that you learned at that time has gone on to, I suspect, save so many other lives. So as bad as it sounds in terms of Edward Johnson obviously dying when he shouldn't have died, but it has also meant you being helping to become.
I'll tell you how I learned that lesson, because it was a pretty harsh lesson. I went to his funeral 10 days later in Walnut Grove, Mississippi, and this young Black woman came up to me. Her name was Mary, and she said, well, I know Edward didn't do it because I was with him at the time of the supposed murder that he was meant to have done. And I said to her, I said, well, why didn't you tell someone? And she said, well, I did. I went to the police and I told them, and they told me to piss off and mind my own business. And, you know, one of the lessons, of course, you learn from that is, if you're a young African-American person in a racist place and you need help, who are you going to call? Now, you can't call Ghostbusters. And the people are not there. And it was my duty, obviously, to go there and, you know, find her and have her talk to me. And that was a massive lesson, because, you know, I was there. I really thought back then that the probability of someone being innocent on death row was very small. I've certainly learned my lesson over that since. You know, I'm in the middle of a big project right now where I'm going back and helping to represent the people who have been executed to determine who was innocent and who wasn't. And it's not because I really care whether someone's innocent, but it's a very important point to make. And I think we're running at least 10% execution of innocent people. So out of 1,532 people, I've currently got 184 pretty good innocence cases. So that's over 10%. And yeah, think about that. I mean, goodness gracious, is that good enough for government work? I don't think so.
No, it's back to statistics and the nature of quantitative data and how it disguises the qualitative nature of people's existence in terms of their
as you say, it's one person, and to me it's just one person of Edward Johnson, and he's the person I lost, who I'm pretty confident is innocent. And you know, it doesn't matter whether all other 1,531 were guilty. That's just not good enough.
So apart from Edward Johnson in obviously 1987, what other particular individuals stand out for you for various reasons, whether it's their personality or things that you've learned along the way? Are there other specifics that you're looking back on it that stand out more than many?
Oh, look, we'd be here for the next several days if you want me to comment on that. It has been so fascinating on 1,000 different levels. There's not a single person I've represented that hasn't presented to me some sort of fascinating story. I mean, I'll give you just one tiny example. So one of the many things I learned was I represented a number of people who were pedophiles. And if you think about the British hate, if you had to identify the group of people that British people hate more than anything else, it's going to be pedophiles. Even Guardian readers, hate pedophiles. And the News of the World classically didn't know the difference between pedophile and pediatrician, so they highlight the house of a pediatrician and people threw bricks through her window. Anyway, any sane person knows that no one chooses to be a pedophile. I mean, if I ask you, would you choose to be a pedophile? Of course you would. It's clearly a mental disorder of some sort, but we let that go right past us. And one of the cases I had was that of Ricky Langley. And Ricky had killed a 6-year-old child, no question about it, and had molested a number of kids before that. And when I was preparing for his second trial, I talked to the mother of the victim, who was a woman called Lorelei Guillory. And Lorelei won't mind that I say that she was an uneducated alcoholic woman from Southwest Louisiana, who you wouldn't necessarily think was gonna show the most humanity and compassion. But she taught me a few lessons. And first, what Lorelei really most wanted to understand was why her child, Jeremy, had been killed. And I explained to her about Ricky and about how incredibly mentally ill Ricky was, and about his whole history, where when his mother had been pregnant with him, she'd been a body cast in Charity Hospital, and no one realized she was pregnant, and they bombarded her with the X-ray sort of their own personal Hiroshima for that little fetus. And then there was one of the drugs she was taking has now been linked to pedophilia, if you believe it, and so on and so forth. And Ricky at age 10 was posting notes on his school notice board saying he was his dead brother Oscar Lee, and all this sort of stuff. And Ricky genuinely believed, when he did strangle Jeremy Guillory, that he was strangling his dead brother Oscar Lee, who was his schizophrenic alter ego. And however hard that is for sane people to believe, that's the truth from Ricky's perspective. And Lorelei spent 3 hours with him in the jail but she wanted to understand what had happened to Jeremy. And he apologized, because even though he's very ill, he knew what he'd done and wanted to apologize. And he told Lorelei the whole story. And at the end of 3 hours, Lorelei turns to him and says, "Ricky, I'm going to fight for you." And she goes down to the DA's office, this twit called Rick Brand, and explains that she doesn't want the death penalty for this guy, just be gone. And Rick says to her, "Oh, you're a very strange defendant, victim," and then tries to take away her second child, labeling her an unfit mother, but she doesn't want the death penalty for the death of her first child. And she ends up testifying for us at the trial. And I asked her one question, which was, "Ms. Guillory, do you have an opinion whether that man over there, Ricky Langley, who killed your child, was mentally ill at the time he did it?" And she turns to the jury and says, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do. I think that Ricky Langley has been crying out for help since the day he was born. And for whatever reason, his family, society, and the legal system have never listened to him. As I sit on this witness chair, I can hear the death cries of my son, Jeremy, but I can still hear that man crying out for help. And I think he was mentally ill." And she advocated for him not to go to prison, but to go to a mental hospital where he belonged. And Lorelei is one of my great heroes. And I hope to goodness, I keep trying this, I hope to goodness one day someone will do a film about her, because she epitomizes what we as human beings should strive for. I'm not saying we can all do it, but we should strive to be as compassionate and understanding. She wasn't forgiving Ricky. She'll never forgive him, but she was showing mercy and understanding. And she's the most extraordinary of women. And, you know, there've been so many like that. I could go on for hours. I mean, it's just fascinating.
What was the outcome for Ricky?
Oh, look, the jurors, we picked a great jury. I love those people. And there were 12 people who both had extensive histories of mental disorders in their family. And they laughed at my bad jokes. And so there's just no way they were going to sentence him to death. And indeed, they acquitted him of first-degree murder, but for various reasons convicted him of something else. That got reversed. It got reversed again. He went through 4 trials, and he's still in prison. But Lorelei would like him out of prison. She'd like him in a mental hospital, as long as he absolutely is going to stay in it forever, which Ricky's totally okay with, because he knows that he can't be cured, and he knows that he's dangerous. And so he actually wants to be studied as a laboratory animal, which is sort of revealing in of itself. But I have a lot of time for Ricky, because no matter how much he lives in a slightly different world than the rest of us, he's people don't give credit to people like Ricky. That he's very intelligent and he understands that we all think he's crazy. It's just that's his world.
And you're obviously now based in the UK, and you've been back in the UK for a while. So do you still go to the States and participate in defending, and do you keep in touch with certain people that you've already mentioned, but certain people from your past that you've created relationships with in that sense?
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, I constantly hear from Sabrina Butler, who was on death row, but we got her acquitted at her retrial. And you're making me feel guilty because I owe Brian Kohlberg a message. And one of these days, what I love to do, I go back to America quite a lot, but one day I'm going to go back and I'm going to tour around all my old clients, because there's some people that I've been closer to than most people. You know, when you do a capital trial, I would average 3 years preparation for any trial that actually went to trial. And so I would know the person I was representing better than he or she would know herself or himself in many ways. And, you know, I became very close to many of the clients, because you can't represent someone, you know, the bullshit they have in England about how you mustn't have an emotional relationship with your client. You're mad. Of course you do. You can't represent someone effectively unless you care. And you can't learn to care unless you really get to know them. And I would love to go and see a whole bunch of my old clients. I'm very fond of many of them.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's beautiful, to be fair. It's beautiful because you're absolutely right. The idea of the British justice system and not forming attachments and being a so-called objective and neutral, and yet you're dealing with these people's qualitative life experiences, which probably says a lot about those lawyers that can detach themselves entirely from their clients.
Well, it's an excuse to behave incredibly badly in the end.
Yes.
Objectivity, you know, to objectively say someone's a bad person is just disgusting, frankly. There's always a reason. There's always an explanation. And if we think about it in terms of someone we love, we've come so far as a society away from what I went through as a child, where I was beaten all the time in school. And actually, I was waterboarded in school too. And nowadays, we think that's just really not a good thing to do, right? And we're gradually moving towards, I hope, more compassion towards everybody. And if you think about it, if I asked you, okay, let's do this. Who's the person in life who you most love? Who is it?
There's no singular individual, obviously the whole of my family. But
just name one. Name one of
them. My wife, Debbie.
What's her name? Debbie. Okay, Debbie is sitting next to me right here. I'm the prosecutor, you're the judge. I say Debbie's murdered someone. Will you send her to prison?
As my wife?
No, as Debbie, as the person you love in life.
So she sat there and
she's the defendant. I'm the prosecutor.
Yes.
I'm saying she killed someone,
Okay.
and I want you as the judge to send her to prison for a long time. Will you do it? You're not going to get dinner if you say yes.
Well, if I have no emotional attachment to that individual, and
No, you're you. We're not putting you in a position of
okay, then the answer is no.
Of course the answer is no. The answer is no for 95% of people, and the 5% who say yes are normally judges, and they're normally emotional sociopaths. And of course we wouldn't do that to someone we love. We'd try to understand them. We'd try to figure out something positive for them, no matter what. And that's the human sensible approach. And the world that sends them to prison is just wacko. It's just one of those mad things that the world does. And I'm not saying there aren't people who are dangerous. Yes, there are. But there aren't, in my experience, and my experience is pretty extensive with over 400 people charged with murder. My experience is that there's always going to be some reason why something happened. And there's always, if there's someone like Ricky who's dangerous, yeah, we have to put him in a hospital because society needs to be protected from them. But that's with the recognition that they're dangerous because they can't control themselves, not because they're dangerous because they're a despicable subhuman being. And one day I hope we'll move towards that.
So is your argument then that as societies we should spend a lot more time looking at cause and effect before we reach judgment?
Well, there's more than that. If I were to ask you what the most despicable thing you've ever done that you're most ashamed of, and my advice is don't answer that question. It's going to be something that's not a criminal offense that really, really hurt someone in a big way. And then if I were to, then if I ask you what's the worst criminal offense that you've ever been a victim of, what is it? What's the worst criminal offense that's been committed against you? What is
it? Against me?
Yeah, unless it's something you don't want to talk about. What is it? You're British, so it's probably something like stealing your bike or something pathetic.
I can't, to be honest, really think of anything clearly.
Oh, come on, you must have had your
wallet
stolen or
the 4 yearly of voting in a Tory government is probably the most worst thing.
No. That is not sadly a crime.
No. Fair point.
What's the worst crime? I've been held up at gunpoint several times. I was a victim of what could be classified as attempted murder one time. Come on, you must have had something happen.
I think the thing that probably stands out for me is being physically abused, not sexually abused, but physically abused at school.
Okay, so that's an assault and battery for which whoever did it could go to prison. Now, which caused more harm? The criminal offense for which someone goes to prison that was done to you, or the really nasty thing you did that's not a criminal offense that you did to someone else? Which caused more harm? Come on, we know the answer.
I don't know, because obviously if you take into account the butterfly effect and what happens down the line, I don't know, to be fair. I really don't know the answer to that.
With the vast majority, not everyone, but with the vast majority, and certainly me, I did something really bad to my dad where I said something to a journalist that I didn't mean to be published, but it was published, where I said, as my father's youngest son, that he had failed in everything he had tried in life, which, sad to say, was pretty true, but was not something anyone should go saying publicly about their parent. My dad read that and it devastated him, and it had an enormous impact on the poor man and did much more harm than the 7 people who held me up at gunpoint in New Orleans.
Yeah, I understand.
And so the question you have to ask yourself with that is, why don't I go to prison when, rather than these young black men who held me up at gunpoint who could get 99 years in prison for that? And yet I get nothing for doing something that had a much worse impact. And so to come back to what you were saying, which is, what should we do? Is it understand? No, the whole legal system is bullshit. The whole legal system is structured on a vindictive approach to a minority group of people. which I think is reprehensible and unjustifiable. And I think until we recognize that, we're not going to begin to make amends.
Thank you, Clive. And to finish off, in terms of, and we've talked about this before in another episodes about the effect of politicians, but did you feel that there was a much more positive trend in place in the US in relation to the death belt, in terms of people on death row who were more likely to end up being put to death as we were coming towards Trump? And do you think the effect of Donald Trump has been to set that back? Or do you think that the system that we have possibly with Joe Biden might be able to reverse some of the damage in this respect of what
I
Trump
don't
did?
think it's quite, I don't think it's really an A or B thing. Look, the first thing is, when the history books are written, they're not going to say, oh, it was really cool the way we murdered people to show that murder was wrong. That's a given. It's sort of like burning witches at the stake. We're not going to come out well in the history books. One of the great ironies, though, is that Americans are gradually moving towards abolition. And so while when I started doing this, 85% of Americans thought that the death penalty was cool. Now it's more like 40%. So it's been cut in half.
Mm.
But at the same time, the Supreme Court's going in the other direction. So the Supreme Court is now 9 people, 6 of whom are Catholic, bizarrely, and 6 of whom will vote to execute pretty much anyone, as was illustrated when Trump, at the end of Trump's time.
Yes.
So that is a huge hurdle between us and abolition, because the Supreme Court are just dreadful at this point. And it's much easiest to abolish the death penalty through legal things than through having to have votes. But, bottom line is we're moving in the right direction, and there were 20 people executed last year. The danger is there are 2,600 people on death row, and you do some simple arithmetic. It's going to take a lot of years to execute 2,600 people at 20 a year. So at some point the dam might burst, and the Supreme Court's not going to stop it, and there's a lot of people looking at dying. So we got our work cut out ahead of us to stop the execution of those individuals, even if we win the battle of abolishing the death penalty in the end.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And one last point that just come to mind. Have you ever represented a female on death row?
Oh yeah, as I mentioned, Sabrina Butler was one of several. I represented a whole bunch of women. It was their stories were all interesting too. And I'm glad to say none of my female clients got the death penalty. And it is a very discriminatory thing. I mean, there aren't many places where you say chauvinism is a good thing, but and it's not a good thing here, but the beneficiaries were women, because representing women was just so much easier, because people were so chauvinist that you just basically say, well, dear old Sabrina couldn't have done this. And they were much more likely to believe that of a woman than of a man. And so there are only 52 women on death row out of 2,600 people. And that illustrates the approach, the chauvinist approach to justice. In this instance, I'm not looking for parity. I don't want there to be 2,550 women on death row. So perhaps that's a good thing.
So on the one hand, you have a chauvinism that's supportive, ironically, of women. But on the other hand, you have a racism that's inherently disproportionately sending Black people.
And it's not just sending Black people, it's also sending people who killed white people to death row much more often. I represented, for example, this Black guy who had murdered a Black woman, bit her to death. Now, it's pretty horrendous. And he clearly had psychological issues. But it was actually really easy to work that out so he didn't end up going to death row because society undervalued the black victim, just as they undervalued the black defendant. So it's racist through and through.
Again, sort of render silence and no words can fill a void. Is there anything that I've missed out, Clive, that you think I should have asked you, or you think that you want?
And only the next three months that we'd talk about it. There's so much to talk about.
Okay. No,
but I think,
yeah. Okay. Again, well, thank you so much. We'll speak very, very soon. Thank you, Clive.
Very good. Nice chat.